All right. Hello, everyone. Um, we'll get started in earnest here in a few minutes, but if you could let us know in the chat that the audio and the video is working, that would be super helpful. Um, and we'll get going here in just a minute. Okay, cool. Sounds like the audio is working. Awesome. Sounds like that's funny. Reads like, I guess, since it's a chat message. Okay. Anyway. Um, all right, so I do have some questions that folks submitted ahead of time, so we'll start with those. Um, but there's a Q&A button in the Zoom meeting app thing where you can submit additional questions. So if they come to your mind while we're chatting, or you want more details, or just questions that you didn't submit earlier, please drop those in the Q&A section, and I will be keeping an eye on that. This is definitely the first one, so I'm not used to all of the software and all of the tools yet. Um, but yeah, this is going to be fun. This is just going to be kind of a low-key hangout and talk about stuff. Um, Okay, so I guess I will introduce myself for folks that don't know who I am. My name is Christopher Moravec. I am the CTO for Dymaptic. Dymaptic is a small custom software development and GIS shop. I have been working in GIS for, I don't know, 16 years, 17 years, something like that. Long enough. Um, and recently, I've been really focused on AI, specifically large language models, and how to use those in practical ways, both inside GIS and just outside, just in my day-to-day work and in my life. Um, and several weeks ago, I started a newsletter talking about AI and large language models specifically, and techniques for using them, and projects that I'm working on, and talking about just how these things work. And so these office hours session, which we're starting out doing this monthly, is kind of an extension of that, and also just an extension of some of the sessions that we do with clients at Dymaptic, where we're talking with folks about their GIS environment, and what works and what doesn't, and best practices that we've seen from other people. So almost all the questions that I have from the beginning here are about large language models or AI in general. Um, but but if you've got questions about just software development in general, or GIS in general, or Esri specific questions, please don't hesitate to drop those in there. That's definitely within the in the realm of things. Um, okay, so I'm just going to start off with this first question here. Um, the first question that I have is, I'm focusing on LLM integration into web maps and dashboards. Do you have examples or experiences with these integrations? I got a couple. So I think the first maybe obvious one for this type of integration is generating arcade from natural language. Um, you can actually use some of these big frontier models like Claude or OpenAI to generate arcade. The biggest downside to that is that it doesn't have context about the layers that are in your map or in your dashboard. So it can generate mostly workable arcade, but it's not going to know about your fields or your layers specifically. You can actually get around that a little bit by going to like the REST endpoint of a layer, and copying the JSON and dropping it straight into either the JSON or the HTML output from just the layer metadata, and dropping it into your prompt before you ask it to write the arcade. And so that's a way you can kind of get around that, and it'll help. We also saw some tech previews from Esri at the Dev Summit about generating arcade, generating symbology, things like that. So I think we're going to see more of those kinds of things coming from Esri soon, those kind of deeper integrations into the Esri UI ecosystem. Um, the other thing that comes to mind, and this would be super fun, I think, but kind of challenging, would be generating dashboards from natural language. The dashboards are just kind of big JSON config files. So you could do it. You would just need a lot of examples to go from description to a JSON output. And again, the complexity is probably in the different data layers and different things that you have to pull together there. Um, Kind of from the other direction, we at work, we often do things like fuzzy data matching, which I wrote about a few weeks ago. It's basically the idea of matching two data sets together where like a regular join won't work because the actual text doesn't match, but there's meaning. This works really well for the names of things, like names of locations or names of facilities that don't match. We use LLMs to process that kind of data so that the dashboard data is more integrated. Um, those are the things that come to mind. Um, I am super curious if there's specific things that you were thinking about when you asked this question. And I didn't actually keep track of who wrote it. So if this is your question and you want to talk about something else, then please drop another one in there. Oh, the other thing that would be kind of interesting would be doing something like a Chrome extension that could detect a dashboard or detect a web map and be able to help you write arcade or help you understand the data or do something like that kind of um, based on the rest of this. Hi, Mom. Uh, so yes, I did get your question, Mom, and I promise I will get to it. Um, okay, so that's the first question. My second question here is what are some of the best practices in implementing AI into a GIS workflow? So this question is fascinating. Um, Mostly, I'm not sure there are actually best practices for implementing AI into any workflow right now. Um, the reason I say that is just because this technology is changing rather rapidly. And the models themselves, we see kind of incremental releases where they've been retrained on newer data and newer information, and those kind of come out every couple of months. But we also see kind of bigger leaps in functionality with some models every 6 to 8 to 12 months. But then the actual technology for integrating large language models into other tools, I feel like it changes every week. Um, so uh, the example that I'm thinking of right now is this thing called MCP, which is the having a moment on the internet right now. MCP stands for Model Context Protocol. Um, this is a standard or a protocol that Anthropic made back in November. Um, and I guess maybe I should back up. So large language models can answer questions that you pose, right? And it has a lot of information stored in its brain and its neural network that it can use to answer those questions. One of the things that they can also do is call to outside resources to get additional information. So this could be something like doing a Google search, or it could be getting the weather for a location. It could be doing um, querying the living atlas for data, any variety of things, ways to just interact with the outside world. And that's called function calling or tool calling inside an LLM. And so MCP is a protocol that Anthropic made to try to standardize that. And it's popular right now on the internet because it makes it a little bit easier to integrate functions if the app or the tool that's running the large language model understands MCP. So before MCP, there were things like LangChain, and I saw somebody did mentioned that in the chat here. LangChain is a derivative of MCP. It's not. LangChain has been around much longer. And I kind of, the way I think about LangChain is it's a way to pull together large language models and even more than one model if you wanted, and function calling to be able to call functions, and also ways to pull in other data, which is called RAG, or retrieval augmented generation, which maybe I'll make a note to come back to that one. And and so LangChain is a way to kind of pull all of that together. It's a big set of Python libraries that all integrate and pull things together. MCP is more standardized than that. It's designed to be, if you can write an MCP hub or endpoint for the Living Atlas, then anything that can talk to MCP can talk to the Living Atlas. So it's more standardized than LangChain. LangChain is more about building your own app to do that. So MCP and LangChain, I actually don't remember. I was looking at this the other day and I can't remember the answer now. I don't remember if LangChain supports MCP already. It actually might. I don't remember now. There's a lot of things starting to implement it. So we'll see if it sticks around though. Like LangChain has been a mainstay. It's been around. It's not going anywhere. MCP, I don't know. It might be having a moment where it goes away. It might stick around. So anyway, the point is this technology changes fairly quickly. So it's hard to nail down a best practice. That said, having done a few AI implementations and different things like this, some things that I would recommend sticking with or doing is, if you're going to do something like try to make a question and answer bot to answer questions for like local government, your county or your city, your municipality, to answer questions about like zoning or permitting or things like that, is have a set of common questions and answers that are curated by humans. And then take those and feed that into your large language model, either as training data if you're going to fine tune it, or just as examples that it can go off of, and use it that way. And that's where a tool like LangChain can become really useful, because you can get those kinds of questions as examples that the AI can then reference. So I would definitely have human curated starting point. The other thing is I would try to keep your focus super narrow. Don't try to build one chatbot to rule them all. I would stick with just answer questions about permitting at the beginning. And because I think that, it takes a little bit more effort to make a chatbot like this than just throwing the legal documents about permitting at it. Like, you got to have a little bit more. You got to have common questions. You need to, if you're going to integrate it with GIS, you have to decide what kinds of GIS questions are you going to answer? Are you going to do just like geocode and address and figure out where you are and what zone you're in, or are you going to try to do something more complex? So I would keep that as simple as you can, and try to start basic with that. Another example is image extraction or detection, and we've for a while, we've had kind of these deep learning models, and like Esri has things in the Living Atlas, which are these pre-trained deep learning packages where you can get models that can run and extract, building footprints and roofs and solar panels and all of that kind of stuff. And those are super useful. But if you want to do a new thing that is maybe related, like if you wanted to look at was this building damaged by fire, then you need to have a bunch of sample data, and you need to retrain those models or fine tune those models to get them to do that new task. Kind of a new emerging way to do this would be to use a large language model. So you can cut out a little square of imagery that's like over the house or the building that you want to know, is this fire damaged? And then you can pass that to an LLM with a custom prompt to ask it, what percentage of this building is damaged by fire? And so the large language models have a surprisingly good ability to do those kinds of things. Maybe not as good as a custom model, but you can do it very quickly. You can get there very quickly with the large language model, um, which is a good first run, or maybe can even help you make sample data to train a better model, so that you have to do less of that work by hand. So that's kind of some starts for best practices. Oh, another thing that I would think about is what models you're using. We've got some folks that want to stick with like open source models and are like trying to run things like um, Llama from Meta, using like OLlama and things like that, and make it fairly easy to just load these models up and run them. And they're actually quite good if you have the hardware to run them at a good speed. They're not as good as the frontier models like Anthropic and OpenAI, but you have a bit more control over them if you want to run them locally. And your data never leaves your own network at that point. So maybe it kind of depends on what that workflow is and whether or not that component is valuable to you. Okay. So we got one new question here. We have an ArcGIS web map that displays the progress of a project. We need to create a web map where users can input the development ID and site development ID, and the map will display only the relevant development boundary along with its associated attributes in the pop-up. Okay, so if you have a web map that displays progress on a project, and yeah, so I don't know exactly what your data looks like, but there are some instant apps which are designed to help you like find specific items and show specific information about one item on a map or one item within a layer. And so you might be able to, I would check those instant apps to see if there's something there that can do what you want and can display that specific information. If the web map is internal only, then, but you want that visible to other people, you're going to have to share that, right? So you're going to have to either share it publicly or you're going to have to share it with specific groups and users. And you can do that with collaborations to other ArcGIS Online orgs or other ArcGIS enterprise orgs. Or let's see. Yeah, you can also use views to limit the data. So if you want to have like a public view that just has a subset of the data or a subset of the attributes, you can use views in ArcGIS Online to limit that and then make a new web map that gets you there. And then you can get, yeah, you can zoom people to features by using query parameters. You can do that in instant apps or in web maps or in Experience Builder and in dashboards, actually, I think. So you can, yeah, so I think there's some way to kind of construct that. Maybe you have a dashboard where you can show all of the development sites and then you click on one and it takes you to the details about a specific one, either in that dashboard or in another way. But something along those lines is where I would go with that. Not sure what the exact intended end use is there, but that's kind of the direction I would go. All right. So let's see here. What's the next question? Oh yeah, I was going to talk about RAG, or retrieval augmented generation, for a minute. So there are kind of three steps to getting a large language model to do what you want it to do. The first step is just asking it, right? We call that prompt engineering, or prompting it with a specific set of data or examples. So there, basically you're asking it to do a task or to evaluate some data or something along those lines. And how you ask it matters, right? You can, depending on the task, sometimes examples are really useful. That's the term of art for that is called few shot or one shot prompting, where you're giving a couple of examples and saying, hey, try to mimic that when you see a new piece of data. So that's like step one. Step two is RAG. And what you're doing is you're trying to get relevant information into the model. And this is something that LangChain makes a little bit easier. But fundamentally, what you're doing is you have a bunch of documents and you want to try to pull the relevant pieces of those documents in to your prompt when the user asks for it. And so we do that most commonly with a thing called a vector database. And the idea is that you can take a paragraph or some sentences of text and you can find out what that is about. And then when the user asks a question, you can use that same measure of what is it about, and you compare it to your existing database and you find other pieces of information that are similar to what the user asked. And then you push all of that into the prompt so that the AI has more relevant current information about that question. That's the idea behind RAG. I think I'm going to actually write a whole series about RAG in my newsletter because that's a common thing that folks have asked me. We've done some examples that do RAGs of various types. The one that I'm thinking of is we recently released a blog post on Dymaptic's site about there was a summary of Esri blog posts basically. And the way we did that is we went through and we used an AI to read all of the Esri blog posts, summarize them, bring that together, and then I could ask it questions or tell it what I thought was important, and it would go find relevant blog posts and bring that together in a new post that summarized all of those Esri pieces. So that uses RAG. So I think I'm going to talk more about that because I think that's actually it's a really useful tool. The third step in kind of the evolution of getting an AI model to do things the way you want is fine tuning it. And that's the process of taking your own data and training the large language model using that data so that it knows about that more intrinsically. It's just built into its own model, its own training. Which that's a good segue into the next question I've got here. And there's a question about, which vector data store. I use DuckDB because they added a vector data store and I wanted a project to use DuckDB. Sorry, the question was which vector DB data store did you use for the Esri RAG implementation? And I used DuckDB in that one. There's lots of different ones out there. You can even like Postgres has its own vector embedding field now. So there's actually lots of ways to do it now. But I kind of liked DuckDB because it was portable and I didn't have to run a server and it just gave me a file on disk and I didn't have that much data to begin with. Okay, so the next question here is thoughts on creating custom AI engines. And this person actually dropped a YouTube video in here. So I'm going to drop this YouTube video back in the chat so everybody has it. And I thought it was actually a pretty interesting video. And basically they go through the process of their decision process for deciding when to train their own model. And I think there are some really good use cases for this, but I also think that the frontier models are so good at things right now that I wouldn't jump to it until you were certain that the frontier model wasn't going to do what you wanted. But there are lots of tools that use this pattern. So things like Copilot and CodeBuff, which are kind of the two coding tools that I use these days, they both use multiple models, multiple neural network models. Some of them are like the big frontier models, like using Claude or ChatGPT to actually write code or make a plan about how to write code. But some of them are specialized models, like I can't think of what it's called right now, but CodeBuff kind of recently, sometime in the last several weeks, added a new model to edit files better. So it's like a special model that its job is to edit files, which is kind of it's a very specific niche neural network, large language model use case, but it's a good example of having a specific model to do a specific thing like that. So yeah, so I think it kind of whether or not you need to create your own model or fine tune an existing frontier model, I think comes down to what you're actually trying to do and whether or not the existing frontier models are good at it or can be prompted to be good at it. Um, the frontier models, like they do cost money, but they are also fairly cheap. Um, so I wouldn't jump to building my own unless I had, I knew I had a large data set that I needed to be able to process, or I knew that I had a large number of users that were coming in, right? That I was going to have to answer or do this process for. Um, yeah. So, or if the model is just not good at it, not good at what oh, thank you for posting that. I had just posted it and I sent it to the wrong group of people. Thank you for posting that. Um, yeah, so okay, so there's several things you can do here. So you can fine tune an existing model, you can or you can make a custom one. And training a custom one from scratch is really hard. It takes a lot of data to do it. So you probably want to start with an existing one. And in that video, they started with, I forget which one exactly, but it was an image processing or image extraction neural network. And then they fine-tuned it to do a very specific task of identifying images on a website or on a Figma layout in their case. And so um, that process, I think, generally kind of falls into the category of fine-tuning a model to do a very specific task. Um, and that can be super useful because you can get it to do it much quicker and you can get it to do it um, in fewer tokens or in fewer words, which is also useful. So even if you're fine-tuning one of the frontier models like Anthropic's Claude or ChatGPT, um, even when you fine tune those, um, you can save yourself money in the long run by um, it'll take less prompting. So your prompt will be smaller, the amount of data you have to provide it or examples you have to provide it is smaller. And so you actually can save yourself money on each call to those frontier models by doing fine tuning. But you do have to have a reasonable amount of data in order to get there. Um, what's kind of interesting, I think, is one of the things that DeepSeek did that was novel, and they did quite a few novel things, but one of the things that they did, and I guess this isn't even that novel, but it made it popularized, is they used a technique called reinforcement learning, which is similar to fine tuning. But what they did is they used existing frontier models like OpenAI and they asked it to generate questions and answers. And then they use those questions and answers to fine tune their own models. Um, and so it's kind of a weird way to do it, but it's basically saying, well, this large language model works the way I want my large language model to. So I'm going to get it to give me questions and answers that are answered in the way I want. And I'm going to use it basically to produce a whole bunch of data. And then I'm going to use that data to train my model or to fine tune my model. So that's actually a really useful technique, even if you have um, a set of human curated like questions and answers. You can use an existing frontier large language model to make more questions and answers. So you can basically say it, hey, rephrase this question and this answer 3 different times, and basically get variations on it that you can use to help fine tune the model, um, which is it's super useful because you can go from just 10 records to 100 records or something like that by asking the model to just build variations on that. So that's actually pretty useful. Um, I think in general, the frontier models are better at things, but it is still the case that it is possible to train specific models that are better at specific tasks, like editing a file or extracting imagery. Um, but I'm not sure how long that's going to be true. Like it depends on what the next evolution of these large language models is over the next few years, I think, to see like how quickly do they get good, and is it possible to kind of replace specialty neural network tools with large language models. So that's, I think, I don't know, that's kind of an interesting one. Um, you can also, before you get to fine tuning or building your own AI engine, you could do RAG to try to make it better at answering questions. I think RAG is a better solution than fine tuning when your data changes frequently. So if you're all constantly adding data uh, that you want the AI to be able to reference, then RAG is probably a better option there. Um, than fine tuning or building your own model, just because you would have to retrain that model constantly as new data comes in. So I think it probably depends. Um, but you also might be able to fine tune a model if your data was very specific. You had a very specific use case. A fine tune model might be better with RAG than a non-fine tune model if your use case is pretty specific. Okay. So next question here. In your experience, how are the various LLMs and agents at writing and debugging ArcGIS-based code for applications? They're pretty terrible, actually. Okay, they're not terrible, but they're not the best. I'll give you an example. I have a friend that was using CodeBuff to try to write a add-in for ArcGIS Pro, and it was all over the place. It did not do a good job. It did not understand all of the classes that were available to it. It needed a lot of help to get there. And there are several reasons that I think that's happened is even though us GIS folks kind of live and breathe this stuff all the time, the ArcGIS SDKs aren't as widespread as like common Python libraries are, like NumPy or Pandas, or common JavaScript libraries are. So there aren't as many examples on the internet for the large language model to base its knowledge on. Um, and then things like geoprocessing tools are different um, than other data science tools like pandas or SQL, right? The idea of doing spatial processing in SQL is like, oh, it's a function called buffer and a function called intersect, and I can write that into my SQL statement, and it follows the pattern of SQL. Um, and so if you have some novel function, you can just tell the AI that, oh, I have this novel function that works in SQL and it follows that pattern. But geoprocessing tools work differently, right? Chaining them together, creating temporary outputs and all of this kind of stuff. And so it's very different from other data processing tools, I think. So I think that's kind of why it's not AIs or large language models are not as good at doing ArcGIS specific things. Um, some things I have done that are useful and helpful, though, um, I will often copy and paste documentation into a prompt. So if I'm using something like ChatGPT or Claude, and I would highly recommend Claude if you're writing like Python scripts or JavaScript, Claude is better at generating code right now than OpenAI's models are. So if I'm doing that, and it's doing it wrong, or if I think that it's going to do it wrong, um, I will copy and paste some of the documentation that I know is useful, and give it to the model so that as part of my prompt, so that it has reference to that, whether that's, going to the web page and printing it to a PDF and dropping it in there, or just copying and pasting a few bits and dropping it directly into the prompt, either one. One thing that I noticed, I was building a Slack bot recently because I wanted an AI powered emoji generator so that I could react with a very custom emoji. That turned out to be quite hard. I couldn't figure out how to get the custom emoji in through the API as an emoji, so it just shows up as a picture. So that was a little disappointing, but anyway. Um, I was doing this in C sharp as an Azure function because I was trying to use that tool to kind of learn how it works now. I haven't used it in many years, and I wanted to kind of see how Azure functions work these days. And we do a lot of work in C sharp, so I was just experimenting with all of that. And CodeBuff is not as good at C sharp as other things like JavaScript and Python. Um, and so it was really messing up on the Slack API. It was just really messing up. And so I had to go open the Slack API myself, and I noticed that they have a copy button next to the AI endpoints in some of their documentation, and you can just hit copy, or not to the REST endpoints, excuse me, not the AI endpoints, the REST endpoints. So you can just go hit copy and then paste chunks of documentation into like a markdown file in your repo, and now you have that as a reference as reference. And that actually helps the AI model quite a bit, just having that reference material. So whether you're putting documentation into a prompt or you're putting it into your repo so that something like Copilot or CodeBuff can use it, that can help quite a bit. Um, it's also just generally better at JavaScript and Python than it is at something like C sharp. So doing something like an add-in for Pro is much harder for the AI models than building a web app. Um, so I think yeah, I think that's kind of at a high level that's the way I think about it. I definitely could not tell you what the syntax for like a select cursor is in ArcPy anymore because I definitely just have Claude write that. Um, I will copy and paste, or I will take a screenshot of my table of contents in Pro and paste that in and ask Claude to write a bit of Python that does X and Y and Z. The last time I did that, it was for the when I was trying to build my base map changer, so it was changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico a bunch of times. Um, I used Claude to write Python to help me do that, and because I don't remember the syntax anymore for select cursors or edit cursors or update cursors, whatever they're called in ArcPy, and Claude does. So, oh, a couple of chats here. Let's see here. Um, oh yeah, I also got stuck trying to get an add-in. I don't have any C sharp experience, but just wanted simple functionality added. Yeah, it's yeah, it's just I think most of the problem is that it's not as good at C sharp, and so then you're asking it to be not as good at do something it's not as good at, and you're asking it to use an API that it doesn't know about very well. Um, but depending on what you're trying to do in that add-in, you might be able to do it with a Python script as a toolbox tool instead, and Claude's much better at that, depending on what you're trying to do. Obviously, different levels of integration. Okay, so here's another question. How does the 100% made in USA picture look right now and going forward? Llama has open for everyone commercials on TV, maybe indicating a long open American development path. Grok 2.3 works better, but costs more, etc. Worried about end customers, business insurance not enjoying use of Chinese models, even if theoretically local only. Yeah, this is a really interesting question. So the part of this question that I have been thinking about recently is things like we have things like whatchamacallit, DeepSeek, where DeepSeek, the company behind DeepSeek, used some pretty innovative training techniques to do things that American AI companies hadn't been able to do. And mostly that's because I think because the American AI companies didn't have to try. So DeepSeek is made by a Chinese company, and they had limited resources. They couldn't use the most powerful AI chips because the United States has been preventing them from having access to it. So the American companies could just spend money and get bigger computers and train things faster. And so they hadn't tried to optimize that training cycle. And DeepSeek they didn't have a choice. They had older hardware that wasn't as fast, couldn't do things in parallel as much. And so they needed to optimize that. And so they spent time optimizing that training process at a fairly low level, actually. Um, Doing some really fascinating things like making sure that GPUs were busy all the time, using one GPU to make sure that other GPUs were busy. Um, so it's a pretty classic use case, but it's also just something that the American companies hadn't had to do because they could just spend more money on more bigger computers. Um, but the other interesting thing is DeepSeek got trained on the Chinese version of the internet, which has history that disagrees with our history. So things like Tiananmen Square, that has the Chinese version of what happened in Tiananmen Square, which is not what happened and is not what the rest of the history books say. And so if DeepSeek answers those kinds of questions wrong, the question becomes, what else does it answer wrong? Um, and so that's a little bit weird. And even though it is an open source model, you still don't know what it was actually trained on because the training material hasn't been open sourced, only the model itself, which is basically millions of numbers. So we don't know exactly what it was trained on. So you'd have to ask it a bunch of questions, which I guess if I was going to ask it a bunch of questions, I'd probably use another AI to formulate questions to ask it to try to figure out if it had other biases, which might be a fun experiment. I haven't tried that. Um, Meta's Llama is an interesting one because you can like run it on old hardware. I ran a pretty, maybe not the biggest version of it, but close to the biggest version on an old laptop that I had. And it could output at about one token or one word per second, which is not terrible. It's definitely not as fast as the frontier models, but it's kind of interesting that you can run that on pretty old hardware. And then there's like the whole movement of people doing things like buying Mac Minis, which have really powerful neural chips on them, um, upgrading their hard drives by hand to have more hard disk space, and then running models like through Olama and things like that on it. So I think that we're going to continue to see the frontier models beat the open source models, but that the open source models are going to be close on their heels because they're going to use techniques like reinforcement learning um, to keep up. Um, and it's going to be possible to do things like fine tune Llama to build a special version of that. So, like, one of the things that we've been bouncing around the idea of at work is building like a dymaptic code generator. And we would take something, it's one of these models like Llama, probably, and fine tune it using code and scopes of work and things like that that we have over time. So like building a code generator that's built from like Dymaptic's point of view, which might be super useful to our own internal staff. It might not be useful to others, but it might be useful internally because it helps us answer questions faster internally based on our historic information. Um, so I don't, yeah, I'm not sure what made in the USA for models is really going to do going forward. I'm not sure. I think that these models are going to continue to step ahead of each other. We're going to see Model A step above Model B, and then Model C is going to leap ahead, and we're going to think, Model B is left in the dust, and sure enough, then it'll pop way forward. I think they're going to continue to leapfrog each other over time. So I think really the most powerful thing to do right now is to keep shifting and shifting which model you're using depending on what you're doing. Um, how much AI do I use in a normal day? I was actually just writing about this in for this week's newsletter, um, and I use it a lot. Um, I have an AI pin that I'm wearing, which is this little thing right here that is from a company called Limitless, which records and transcribes all of my conversations so that I can keep track of all of the things I said I would do. And it's hooked to a large language model, so I can ask it questions at the end of the day, like what are all the things I committed to, um, and make my to-do list from that. And so I use it for that kind of stuff all the time. I use it to help with my writing all the time, and I know this can be kind of a uh, some people don't like the way it writes, and I sometimes it doesn't write very well. I agree. And so I usually use it to give me feedback about my writing, to tell me parts of it that are confusing or might be interpreted differently by a different person who doesn't have the background or the context that I do, and try to get the AI to give me that feedback instead of rewriting it for me. Um, and at my point in my ability to write things, that's really useful to me to have those extra points of view and that feedback about what's confusing or what's not confusing to other people. Um, I also though, if you have been writing for years and you're writing uh, and you have just this gigantic wealth of experience writing, then it might not be that useful to you. And I mean, that's okay. Like it might not be a very good editor for you. You might need a very sophisticated person to be your editor. And that's okay. There's probably something else that you can use it for, like brainstorming names or looking up words and phrases, things like that. I also use it to summarize meetings, sometimes to build rough drafts of deliverables. I don't think it's very good at that. But what it does do is it kind of gets me in the mode. It gets me thinking about that project or that client or that meeting. So I often use it before the next meeting to kind of jog my memory. What did we talk about last time? Where's my mind need to be for this meeting? Um, and and or to kind of get me going in the right direction for building a deliverable for after a meeting. Like if I have to do a design document, I might use GPT or Claude to give me a summary to kind of get me going and get me thinking about it. It's not going to be perfect, but it gets my brain moving, which is oftentimes what I need. I use it to write code all the time. I use CodeBuff right now to do most of my code writing. I use it to build complete applications. Um, it's not perfect. I definitely have to go in and fix things and look up how stuff works. It gets tripped up on all of the same JavaScript junk that I get tripped up on, ironically, like, oh, this won't build anymore because these dependencies are messed up. It can get stuck on those same things. So oftentimes I have to get it out of that kind of situation. Um, yeah, my tips there are using a knowledge.md file to describe what it is that you want to do. Like describe well what you want it to build, much like you would to a human developer, so that it has background as context, so that when it's making decisions that you didn't specify, it has some background information about what the application is supposed to do to make a better default decision. You still have to remind it of things and guide it through it. It definitely takes step by step right now. If you just kind of let it go off for an hour, it doesn't always work very well, but it definitely can help with that. CodeBuff is also pretty good at making a plan. So you can ask it to make a plan to add a feature to a tool. I actually have a coworker that uses it to make the plan and then goes and writes the code themselves in C# in this case. And so like it making that plan is super useful, but it can't do the code because it's C# and it's just not as good at it. Um, how does AI improve the meaning or understanding of data? This is actually a really fascinating question. I think the most common way that it helps me is getting into the right headspace. I mentioned that a second ago for a particular client or a project or a meeting. And the thing that I'm working on is just bringing me back to that space, and helping me get there. Um, it helps me understand things. So like if I don't know a word, I can look it up in a dictionary, but sometimes it's easier to copy and paste a few sentences out of a document and ask Claude, hey, what does this word mean in this context? And I have this other app idea actually where I want to have a Chrome browser extension so that when I'm reading like a scientific paper about AI or quantum mechanics or something that I like, those kinds of documents are really dense and they take me a long time to read them because I'm not an expert at reading those. And it would be really cool though to have a Chrome extension where I could like highlight a sentence and say explain this sentence to me in the context of the whole paper. right? So then that extension could use an LLM. It could go look up Wikipedia, it could go look up words in the dictionary, kind of synthesize that together, but then also read the document that it's in and give me a definition for that thing in context, which I think would be super useful. I use it to explain jokes I don't get. I know that's kind of embarrassing, but sometimes I don't get jokes. So it's really good at explaining those. Explaining geoprocessing tools or helping me brainstorm what geoprocessing tool might help me solve an answer or might help me solve a problem. Um, Converting teenager to English. That's fun. I have a project about that, but I will save that for the end if I have a few minutes. Got a couple more questions. Have you used Copilot? If so, to what extent? So GitHub Copilot, yes, I've used that quite a bit. Um, I still use it when I'm manually writing code. Although I use CodeBuff to write a lot of bulk code because it can type much faster than me. So if it can convert a couple of paragraphs of text in a simple design document into, a couple hundred lines of code in a few minutes, that's a big multiplier for me. Um, but when I'm editing, I'm going in there to fix something or make a tweak or write a piece of code myself because I'm interested in it. And that's something I do if I'm interested in a piece of code. I definitely go and write that myself. Um, I use GitHub's Copilot. And I think it's actually the way I think about GitHub's Copilot is that it's really sophisticated autocomplete. A funny story I have about a coworker is they got on an airplane going to meet me at a conference or something, and they were trying to write code on the plane, but they didn't have internet access, and they hadn't realized how much they would depended on Copilot because it had been helping and making them more efficient this whole time, and then suddenly they didn't have it, and it was like, oh man, have I forgotten how to code? Uh, no, they didn't forget how to code, but um, it was a really good measure of this is actually a useful tool. Um, if you're talking about the Copilot from Microsoft, I have not used that as much. I have used it, I've tried it a couple of times to do things. I didn't get good results, and I haven't gone back to really experiment with it again. Probably the most common use case, I think that Microsoft Copilot has a search in Office 365, and I'm kind of disappointed in that search. It doesn't find the documents that I'm looking for, but that might be because I don't have the permissions set right or something. I need to spend some time looking at how that might help. Um, Most of the time I use the models like Claude or GPT directly. A lot of times I go straight to the API console because I find that, or using tools like OpenWebUI. Um, but I find that talking to those directly is often useful. Okay, so now I have my last two questions are from my parents who signed up for this webinar. So thank you, Mom and Dad, for coming. Um, how can GIS and AI help manage water irrigation needs for hay fields? I have no idea what the water irrigation needs for hay fields are. So I asked ChatGPT. Um, I think it pointed out kind of the obvious things like irrigation depends on soil type, typography, slope, things like that. All things that you could use GIS to analyze to try to understand, like, if I overwater, where's that water going to go or where's it going to collect? Um, you might then be able to analyze trends over time with GeoAI. I think I'm not sure that was a very good idea that GPT had there. If you had a large irrigation operation, I suspect you could do like real-time monitoring, which might be kind of fun to see like where's water going. And then you could probably map that with like a drone where you're looking at like what is the growth of my crop over time compared to the water and like looking for dry patches or things like that using a drone. So that might be kind of fun and using like GeoAI tools or whatever to kind of mash that together. And obviously, I would use large language models to write all the code to glue those things together because that would be more efficient. And another common thing that I use it for is reading PDF files or documents, old historical documents, things like that that might not be digitized more than a scan. AI is pretty good at reading those. Um, mom just told me she would buy a drone to fly the hayfields. Okay, well, there we go. Um, how can I create an app to collect and collate participant evaluations for nail? Um, I if I was going to try to collect data, um, for you, mom, I would probably use Google Forms. That would be my first default because that just loads it into a Google Sheet and then you can kind of manipulate the data from there. Um, if you were if you were needing to collect spatial data also, you could do that in ArcGIS Online with Survey 123 and make a public survey that people could fill out and it could collect their location data too. Interestingly, Esri has a an AI assistant for building Survey 123 forms, which is actually it's not bad at getting started. It's definitely falls short of being able to do some of the really advanced things that we might do in Survey 123 as humans. But it's a really good way to get a draft out the door in a few minutes instead of having to do it yourself. Although I don't know. The drag and drop interface is also pretty good. So if you're depending on what your experience is with Survey 123, you might be able to get it. Once you had participant evaluations, you could definitely use AI to read them and collate them for you. But I would definitely watch out for bias. AI will have bias based on like someone's name or something like that. So I would try to scrub names out when you pass it to the AI or ask the AI multiple times because you'll get different results if you ask it a couple of times. Okay, well, it's almost to the end of the hour here. That was actually really fun for me talking about all of this. And kind of going through all of these questions. So I want to thank everybody for coming along and joining me on this. Um, if I missed any questions in the chat while I was talking, I apologize for that. I'm still learning how to use all of these tools. So um, yeah, if there's things that you'd like to see differently in the future, please let us know. I didn't actually share my screen at all this whole time, which I just realized. So maybe that would be something I would do in the future is have like a mini project that to go look at and kind of share how I would use that, how I would use an AI model um, to do that. So we're doing these monthly. So the next one is going to be May 6th, which I think is a Tuesday at the same time, just a slightly different day of the week. So sign up for that. And Holly dropped the links to that and the link to um, my newsletter in there. There'll be another episode of the newsletter tomorrow. That comes out weekly, and I'm talking about different use cases for AI, different thoughts and projects. Some of it is kind of deep and technical, or will be more deep and technical too. Um, but I've also got some funny ones planned, like the time that I had ChatGPT write me a recipe for stroganoff, and it was really popular. I actually made it twice that week, so it was actually pretty good at writing that recipe. So that'll be a fun one that I'll share in the future too. Okay, thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you at the next one.